So we all know that data is the most vital asset that any organization can have. But what if that organization is based in different countries, has customers that are facing different regulations when it comes to compliance? We're going to take a look at a technology called Fybrik that's been used by ING, very well-known international bank. To start out with that, we have someone from ING. Barry, can you just describe overall the multinational banking environment? What are some things that folks need to keep in mind?
Yeah, well, ING's history is pretty long. We have a background in mergers, acquisitions, adding new labels. Eventually, it ended up in ING as the overall label. That comes with also a huge technical history, where we have big monolithic systems like mainframes, classical banking systems, HP nonstop, those kind of things. So we've been really struggling the last couple of years to get rid of that legacy. And that's also why we started looking at cloud adoption, of course, as the first go. Well, bank on public cloud is still a bit itchy because of the risks and the security and those kind of things. So we started out with a private cloud, which is now being used by, I think, up to 20 countries, of which we have a footprint in already. And of course, Kubernetes is a next step in that to make our landscape even more agile and make use of the latest, newest technology to replace all of those old systems. The challenge in that, where we saw and where we started looking at Fybrik, was that in the past we had those big monolithic systems, so we knew where the data resided. It was always on that big machine. Now going to cloud, Kubernetes, you get a fully distributed landscape. So it's harder to know where the data actually resides. And that's also why we stepped into the Fybrik part and started working on it and joining in the open source thing to add the governance aspects that are for us as a bank really critical in that concept.
Good. And are there other business challenges that you at ING faced related to data and how it's being used in public-private cloud environments?
Yeah, there's two major problems. I'm an information architect, so I'll focus on the data and the IT part. There, I think, lie for us the biggest challenge that we need to tackle. And the governance, as mentioned before, being in control of your data, knowing sure where it is, that you have the latest for reporting to regulators, but of course, more important to our customers, and make sure that they have the latest information available on their transactions, their status, their financial bookkeeping. The other one is IT efficiency, making sure that you don't copy the data everywhere. That we keep the costs in mind. As a banker, we're paying attention to money, of course. So the costs need to be regulated and under control. So for us, those are the two major challenges that we're focusing on in refurbishing our whole landscape from the 30-year-old history to hopefully a state-of-the-art new install base.
Now, with that in mind, we want to turn it over to Flora, who's working with Fybrik, working on it. Now, Flora, what are the technical challenges that you had when assisting ING in terms of addressing these business challenges that they were facing?
Let me start by sharing my screen with a very simplified illustration that shows how Fybrik comes into this place and assists. So this is the situation before Fybrik. We have a data user that wants to access data. The data is located somewhere. And the data user, Eva, in this case, she has a workload to analyze customer data. The customer data has some sensitive information in banking, of course. Let's take the social security number as an example. So Eva needs to ask the data governance officer of the organization for permission to access a customer data set. Serena, the data governance officer, needs to ask another department, the IT admin team, to get a redacted copy without any sensitive customer data, specifically for Eva. So the IT admin, she asked the team to get a redacted clean copy of the customer data set, and the IT admin needs to generate a clean copy. The social security number is masked by the IT admin, and only after this, he can provide Eva credentials to the customer data set And ever after waiting for a while, it could be weeks, it could be days, it could be months when you have many teams in different geographies and each one of them has their own to-dos. You need to wait in line until you get a response. So it might take even months until she gets access to the data, and only then she can analyze the data and start her actual work. So there are several pain points for each one of these personas. The data user, when she wants to run analytics, needs to wait a long time to get the data. Serena, the data governance officer, she has to take care of the privacy. She can make policy recommendations, but she cannot enforce them. She doesn't have an automatic way to enforce the policies. And she spends a lot of time reviewing requests from different users. The IT admin team needs to make several copies per request. There is cost in storing these copies. There is work in managing the copies. It might have orphan data. After Eva finished the work, she might need go back to Tim and tell him that he can delete the copy. And it doesn't always happen. So, and users had the credentials. So these are several pain points for each one of these organization team or organization personas. So with Fybrik, the case becomes much more automated and easier. Eva, the data user, asks from Fybrik access to the customer data set after she found the dataset ID in a data catalog. Fybrik orchestrator automatically deploys modules, read module and mask module that has the credentials to the customer data set, and on the fly it returns to Eva an endpoint URL to the model, which provides the customer data set already cleaned and masked. You can see the social security number was masked on the fly. Serena, the data governance officer, had a way using Fybrik to define the governance policies rules upfront. She doesn't need to do it per user, per request. She does it once per dataset because she knows in the dataset which fields are sensitive. Tim, the IT admin, also has to do something once upfront. He can define which Fybrik models are available for Fybrik control plane. He has a way to declare the available infrastructure. For example, if there are storage between the data itself and the workload, might be when we have several clouds in different locations, different geographies, we might have several storage accounts. So he has a way to define that. And he can also define rules for the enterprise, like if we want to minimize the latency, if the workload is something that needs very fast response, or maybe minimize the storage cost if we don't care for the latency and we do care for the cost of the storage. So Fybrik enables all this. The value in Fybrik that the data user has an automated data access without waiting time. The IT admin does not need to spend time making copies and no need in cost in unnecessary copies and many redundant copies. The data governance officer can be sure that her recommendations are enforced, which is very important for customer data set for banks and insurance company or every company that has sensitive customer data. The credentials are kept inside Fybrik in the system code. It's not provided to the data user, so he cannot share it. And there is no need in copies.
Very good. That being said, you've given a wonderful overview of all the different stakeholders that are involved in this process. But Alexey, if we want to take a little bit of a deeper look in terms of implementation, how would that be? Could you fill us in on that?
Yeah, sure. So we have seen that the difference in how the actors works and how it happens behind the scene. So this is a very high level view of the Fybrik. And you can see all three on the left, all three actors that Flora mentioned before. And we have a fourth one. It's a data owner. The data owner is the one who made the secondary use of the data set available. He provided some information about the data set. Is it HR data? Is it financial data? Put it in the catalog. Whatever it may be. Other information, he may tag it. For example, is it confidential or part of the data is confidential, like we saw, for example, for this social security number, it's personal information. And Fybrik takes the information of all different actors provided, including the library of models. Models that we mentioned previously are the underlying capabilities, what are available to be used in the flow that Fybrik generates. So it might be models for reading different types of data, it might be models for masking, transformation, encryptions, etc., for making copies. These models, they can be home grow, or open source, or some kind of third-party developed. And in order to include this in the library, we provide CRT to register that these models are available. It's one of the tasks that the team, like IT admin, does. So this library of Fybrik takes in information about the models. The requirements came in front of actors from the left, and Fybrik makes the decisions. The first one, which the capabilities are required for the request. Do I need to cache it? Do I need to move the data close to the workload? Maybe something else? Where each of these capabilities need to be run? If we have several clusters, we can run in different places. And the last one, it's maybe a more technical level, which type of capabilities deployed? Maybe multi-tenant or single tenant, etc. And usually can be more than one answer of these questions. And Fybrik has a very unique optimization capability to determine which is the best balance between all different requirements of all different actors. It scores the decisions, which is the optimum one. The optimization is done based on all of the items listed here in red, provided by different actors. It can be data governance decisions, types and requirements of the workload, what is the capabilities of underlying infrastructures, what's the cost and performance. And ultimately decides what to deploy and where to deploy as optimal as possible. And Flora, if you can go to the next slide, maybe slightly deeper dive. Of course, we cannot go to all details. We have very short time. If somebody is interested, we can provide offline deep dive. But in general, Fybrik, which we call the control plane, is interface with three external system. One is the data catalog, in order to get information about the data set, the intent of the data set, and no less important, the metadata about these data sets. And typically in catalogs, of course, they store the links to the connections, how to access the data. Credentials for accessing these data sets may be stored in the data catalog, or may be stored in external credential manager. And the last one, it's a data governance engine, which Sabrina, as a government officer, uses to define and evaluate the rules. The agent itself provided to Fybrik decisions. So the Fybrik, through the data policy connector, says which is the context. This is the data is required. What we want to do with the data? Maybe reading, writing, copying, ingestion. And the data policy agent returns not the rules, but rather the decision about the context. And Fybrik then uses all this information plus library of models. In other words, a library of capabilities, addressing the non-functional needs, and runs its optimizer and creates a plane of what capabilities is the flow data between these capabilities, where each of the capabilities has to be deployed, and ultimately generates what we call the plotter, which is an overall view, and blueprint controller actually does deployment on each of the relevant clusters. And it's a very high level descriptions, and again, we will be happy to provide more details.
Fantastic. You mentioned, we're looking at the side of implementation. Now going back to the ING side, Maryna, could you tell us about what was your experience like working with the open source? What was your role? And just give us a feel for what it was like to be on the other side of this.
Yeah, typically I think when one thinks about open source, either contributing or working with open source projects, one would not necessarily think of a bank as a top contender to do so. But it's interesting enough, we, at least from ING perspective, do work together and contribute also with number of open source projects. And Fybrik is a very good example. And I will say also quite a positive experience that we had so far. So it's all about collaboration. And from our side, we are bringing more or less real life examples, use cases and requirements from the industry perspective. So we mentioned already about the governance a little bit, especially being from the financial industry, and also me and Barry being an information architect, so quite dear to our work. But also from IT perspective and infrastructure, how do you optimize for the requirements and tasks that you have? On the other side, you have a Fybrik team who also have expertise in design and development. So it's a really good way to collaborate from different perspectives and to make sure that we design together, we brainstorm, but also do the validation on what we have developed or designed actually addresses the pain points. On the other hand, also, it's an open source area, right? So for engineers, and we also have quite a lot of engineers in ING, it's quite interesting area to participate. And we also had an engineer from our side, and she contributed to design and development of the feature itself. So she also was quite happy that she got to work as a part of the bank on open source. I think another benefit worth mentioning is the ability to do POCs and POVs in this setting of collaboration. Again, coming back to having an opportunity to validate what has been, developed and designed actually addresses the use cases. And generally speaking, Fybrik being also open source not only helps with somewhat freedom and flexibility to collaborate, but also helps more with the speed and kind of depth of the innovation itself, because it's a bit of a different setting that you're working with as an open source community as well.
Good. With that in mind, thinking about the next steps, working with a bank is something that most open source projects, are dreaming of in terms of their roadmap. For the folks at Fybrik, Flora, Alexey, what's the status? What are the next steps? What can we expect to hear about in the future regarding Fybrik?
So in the last pilot we have done with ING, we added features of optimizing storage cost and optimizing latency depending on the declarative needs of the personas. So this is something that we would like to enhance more. There are many more options to optimize user optimization across different clouds and different cloud providers and different cloud locations. And let me share another slide, which I would like to give credit to, just a second, to Einat O, who prepared it. It's a slide that shows the landscape of different data-related technologies on cloud, of course. And we have here red rectangles, which is different technologies or open source. We already integrated, as Alexey mentioned, we have a library of modules with different capabilities. And connecting to other open source technologies or open source or technologies, we actually enlarge our capabilities to read different formats, for example, using Trino to read iceberg format. And so we also want to enhance and enlarge our library by connecting to different open source. And we have here in red those that we already connected to, and some with dashed red, which we explored. And yellow ones are the ones that we are planning to go forward and do. And in addition to connecting to different technologies and enhancing our libraries, we have also additional use cases in mind, like masking and transforming on unstructured data, like images, forms, signatures, license plates, etc. It could be even on audio files or there are many options to enhance Fybrik, and it actually depends about the customers that will be interested, what will be interesting for customers. And we invite other open source folks to join us, collaborate with us, bring other needs. We know there is need to govern sensitive data in logs, for example, and messages and different applications. So the sky is the limit.
Sky is the limit. I think it's a very good way to finish. There's a very broad landscape, lots of different opportunities to get involved, and seeing the value that's being provided here, I think is very promising. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this panel. As Alexey mentioned, there are a lot of different things that weren't covered that we should definitely cover, hopefully in a second session at some point. So you can definitely expect to hear more about Fybrik in the future. Perfect. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.